The night over the Afghan mountains was thick and moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and light alike, where every shadow could conceal an ambush and every ridge could become a sniper's perch. And for the Navy SEAL team crawling their way through the jagged terrain, air support felt like a dead promise, something that had existed once in the days of thunderous jet strikes and steady cover overhead but had long since abandoned them to dust, silence and the slow grind of ground warfare. Their radios crackled only with static when they called for help, and when the team leader cursed under his breath about command never delivering, the others shared the same grim silence, a silence born not from discipline but from the resignation of men who knew they had been written off. Hours earlier they had been dropped into this valley to intercept a convoy believed to be ferrying weapons from Pakistan's tribal belt into Taliban strongholds, but what was supposed to be a precise ambush had turned into a disaster. The convoy had been a decoy, and before the SEALs realized it, they were surrounded by dozens of fighters who seemed to pour endlessly from caves and trails, armed with RPGs, PKM machine guns, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The firefight had raged for 3 hours already, bullets ricocheting off rocks, dust stinging their eyes, and every man down to his last magazines. One SEAL had already taken a round through the shoulder and was bleeding heavily, another was hit in the leg and could barely drag himself behind cover, and still the enemy kept pressing closer, yelling war cries that echoed off the valley walls, reminding the team just how deep they were behind hostile lines. The team leader, Lieutenant Warren, pressed his back against a boulder slick with his own sweat and whispered to himself that maybe the higher-ups had been right when they said close air support was too slow, too outdated, too imprecise in this new kind of war, that drones and satellites had made the A-10s and gunships obsolete. He remembered briefings where brass dismissed pilots as relics and spoke of ground teams as self-sufficient hunters who could fight alone with technology guiding them, but as another RPG slammed into a ridge and showered the SEALs with shards of stone, Warren muttered that technology wasn't bleeding for them now. He grabbed the radio again, called into the void with coordinates, his voice hoarse and raw, and got nothing but static, yet he still kept pressing the transmit button as if hope itself depended on the repetition. Across the valley the insurgents lit fires to blind the Americans' night vision, and under that wavering orange glow the SEALs could see dark silhouettes advancing steadily, shouting, firing, and closing the noose. One of the younger SEALs, blood on his cheek and fury in his voice, snarled that they were about to die forgotten. And Warren almost believed it until the first distant thunder rolled across the sky, low and metallic, not the sound of artillery or bombs but the unmistakable growl of twin turbofan engines pushing a beast of steel through the heavens. The insurgents paused too, their fire slackening as they tilted their heads toward the sound, and in that pause came a ripple of disbelief through the SEAL ranks, because they recognized that growl, old and guttural, the sound of something that wasn't supposed to exist in their battles anymore. Then, slicing through the darkness like a hawk over prey, an A-10 Thunderbolt II swept low over the valley, its brutal silhouette outlined against the faint starlight, and with that sight came the roar of its G8 Avenger cannon, spitting 30mm shells that chewed the mountainside into fire and thunder. The ground shook as if a god had stepped down into the fight, the orange tracer lines carving arcs through the night and tearing into enemy positions with a savagery no drone strike could ever replicate. Dust and flame swallowed the ridges where insurgents had been seconds before, and their cries turned from war chants into screams of panic, men scattering like ants before a flood. The SEALs, stunned into silence, watched as the jet banked hard, low and menacing, its engines howling with raw defiance, and in the cockpit sat Captain Elena Rios, one of the last A-10 pilots still flying combat tours, a woman who had been told again and again by commanders that her plane was obsolete, that her skills belonged to another era, and that the battlefield had no need for her kind of flying. Yet here she was, eyes sharp behind her visor, hands steady on the stick, answering a call she had never even received because she had been monitoring the valley, against orders, knowing that boots on the ground always bled hardest when bureaucracy declared air power dead. Her radio came alive at last, her voice calm but edged with fire, telling the SEALs to mark their position, to hold tight, to trust her thunder. Warren, his throat raw with disbelief, fumbled a flare into the night sky, and Elena rolled in again, her A-10 diving like judgment itself, spitting fire, shattering boulders and sending enemy fighters into wild retreat. For the first time all night, the SEALs felt the weight of the battle shift as if the mountain itself had chosen sides, and in that seismic moment Warren realized that air power was not dead at all. It had simply been waiting for the right pilot, the right machine, and the right fury to return. The valley reeked of smoke and cordite as Elena pulled the A-10 into a steep climb, the G-forces pressing her body into the seat while her eyes scanned the jagged ridges below for muzzle flashes, and she caught sight of dozens of fighters scrambling like startled insects, trying to melt into caves and ravines, but she had hunted long enough in skies just like this to know that mountains never truly swallowed men, they only disguised their desperation, and with her finger light on the trigger she banked again, rolling into another firing run that unleashed a river of 30mm shells ripping the night apart, each impact shaking the bones of the SEALs huddled below who clung to their rifles like lifelines, hardly believing the storm that had descended for them. For Elena, though, this was not surprise but inevitability, because she had never believed the Pentagon's declarations that her plane was obsolete, she had never accepted the boardroom arguments that said drones with missiles could replace the terrifying precision of a gun run conducted just 30 feet above a friendly unit's head. She had trusted only in what she had seen with her own eyes over years of combat, and what she had seen was that the ground never lied. Men in firefights needed the psychological hammer of the A-10 as much as its firepower. They needed to hear the growl of its engines and the ripping thunder of its cannon to believe they might live through the night. Below her, Warren shouted into the radio with new life, guiding her onto enemy concentrations, his voice no longer broken but sharp with urgency, calling out ridgelines and clusters of fighters who had rallied to fire back with RPGs that spiraled upward like comets trying to swat a hawk. But Elena danced her plane through the fire, rolling, dipping, strafing, her rounds tearing trenches through stone and flesh alike, each pass cutting away another wave of pressure that had been suffocating the SEALs for hours. She thought of the commanders who sat behind polished desks insisting that wars were mathematical, that precision came only from satellites and algorithms, and she almost laughed inside. Her oxygen mask, because precision was the feel of your stick vibrating with turbulence, the split-second judgment of distance and angle as tracer fire stitched the earth, the ability to bring hell within 50 meters of friendlies without touching a single one of them, and she knew no drone could ever taste that, no drone could ever hear the panic in a soldier's voice and respond with fury shaped like salvation. On the ground, the wounded SEAL who had been bleeding out gasped in disbelief as Elena's strikes forced the enemy off his flank, giving his brothers a chance to drag him to better cover, while another SEAL, out of ammunition, picked up a fallen enemy's rifle and found the courage to keep fighting now that the sky itself had joined their side again. The insurgents, who only minutes before had been so certain of their victory, now fired wildly into the darkness, their formations unraveling under the relentless roar from above, and Warren knew they were witnessing not just firepower but the psychological collapse of men who had believed air power was gone from this valley forever. Elena rolled once more, eyes narrowing on a cave mouth that pulsed with muzzle flashes, and she loosed a string of rounds that collapsed the entrance in a burst of rock and flame, the shockwave slamming outward and silencing every weapon inside. As she pulled up, she could almost hear the voices of old instructors and fellow pilots who had retired under protest when the brass started mothballing squadrons, men and women who had whispered bitterly that someday troops would die abandoned because someone behind a desk had decided a spreadsheet mattered more than a soldier's heartbeat. And in that moment she felt she was flying for all of them too, carrying their ghosts in her cockpit. The SEALs regrouped, shouting encouragement to each other, rallying behind the sudden shift in momentum, and Warren, sweat and blood streaking his face, felt for the first time all night that survival was more than a fading hope, it was a reality now anchored to the sky. Yet Elena knew the fight was far from over. She could see movement beyond the ridges, fresh fighters pouring in, heavier weapons being dragged into position, mortars being set up with frantic hands, and she knew that the insurgents had numbers on their side, even if their courage was shaken. Her fuel gauge ticked lower, her ammunition count dwindled, but she ignored the numbers the way a warrior ignores the odds, because to leave now would mean condemning those men below to the fate command had already written for them, and she refused to be the kind of pilot who measured lives against fuel. Over the radio she called Warren, her voice steady and sharp, promising him she would hold the valley until reinforcements came or until she had nothing left to give, and in his chest something stirred that he had not felt in years. Faith, not in command, not in strategy, but in another warrior who had chosen to fight for them without hesitation. The mountains lit again with fire as Elena rolled into yet another attack run, her cannon's growl echoing like thunder across the valley floor, and every man who heard it, friend and foe alike, knew that air power was not dead, not while she still drew breath, not while the thunderbolt still screamed across the night sky with her hands on the stick. The night had grown into a storm of fire and steel, and though the insurgents had been driven back in chaos, Elena knew from the glow of movement on her sensors and the sharp bursts of tracer fire clawing upward that they were not broken yet. They were regrouping beyond the valley, drawing upon reserves hidden in caves and gullies, trying to bring mortars and recoilless rifles into range, desperate to smother the SEALs before dawn exposed the battlefield fully, and she could feel the pressure in every muscle of her body as she swung the A-10 low again, eyes scanning for targets, hands precise on the controls as she stitched another line of destruction across a ridge that threatened to pour fighters into the SEALs' rear flank. On the ground, Warren and his men were pulling themselves together, dragging the wounded behind slabs of rock, rationing ammunition, and marking enemy positions with hurried infrared strobes, each flash of light a plea to the sky for salvation. And when Elena's cannon answered, spitting destruction within arm's reach of their foxholes, the men cheered through cracked lips and dust-choked throats, their morale fueled by the simple truth that someone above them cared enough to risk everything. Yet as Elena pulled up and leveled out, her HUD flashed warnings about fuel consumption and remaining ammunition, and she bit down hard against the reality that she could not keep this pace forever. Her squadron commander had already told her before this sortie that the A-10 had no business being here, that drones would handle overwatch while she rotated to the rear. But Elena had ignored the orders because she had been in too many briefings where command spoke of acceptable losses and statistical margins, words that tasted like betrayal to a pilot who had listened to ground troops beg for cover in the dead of night. She thought of her father too, a Vietnam veteran who had once told her that real warriors were the ones who stayed when everyone else left, who fought with grit rather than gadgets, and she wondered if he would hear her tonight in the rumble of her engines, if somewhere beyond this valley he would smile knowing his daughter had chosen defiance over obedience. Below her the insurgents launched another wave, this one more desperate, their tracers forming walls of red that clawed upward into the night, and mortars began to pound the SEAL positions, shaking the valley with concussive blasts that sent dirt and rock raining down onto helmets, threatening to finish what the earlier ambush had started. Warren barked orders, shifting his team into tighter defensive arcs, trying to cover the wounded while returning fire with dwindling rounds, but even as he fired his last magazine he knew their survival hinged not on their rifles but on the lone shape circling above like a steel predator refusing to abandon its prey. Elena dove again, bringing her jet so low the mountain ridges seemed to scrape her wings, and unleashed another strafing run that cut across the mortar teams, bodies scattering like leaves in a storm, explosions swallowing their positions, and for a heartbeat the valley seemed hers entirely, a theater where she alone commanded the script of life and death. Still, the fuel alarm blinked more insistently, and her ammunition counter dropped toward zero, and in the back of her mind the calculus of survival screamed that she needed to pull out, to refuel, to rearm, yet the sight of those men below, bloodied but unbroken, anchored her to this sky, and she whispered into her mask that she would not leave until dawn or death came for her first. The radio crackled with Warren's voice, hoarse and urgent, telling her they could hold if she could just keep the pressure on a little longer, and she smiled bitterly because she knew he was lying. He was trying to ease the burden from her shoulders, but she had been in war too long to believe anything but her own eyes, and her eyes told her that if she left, those men would be overrun within minutes. The insurgents, sensing her dwindling firepower, began to push harder, shouting, firing, their courage rekindled by the thought that even the mightiest machine eventually runs dry, and Elena clenched her teeth as she banked again, rolling in with her last belts of 30mm shells, pouring them into the densest cluster of fighters she could see, ripping the ground into fountains of dust and fire, buying precious minutes with every strike. On the ground the SEALs fought like wolves, scavenging weapons from fallen enemies, patching wounds with torn fabric, their spirits refusing to break under the shield of thunder above them, and Warren felt something primal awaken in his chest, a bond to that unseen woman in the sky, a bond forged not by orders but by shared survival, and he shouted her name into the radio when she finally identified herself, promising her that they would hold with her as long as she could hold for them. The minutes stretched like lifetimes, the night an endless cycle of fire and silence, and though Elena's jet screamed its warnings at her, though her muscles ached from strain and her vision blurred from the endless focus, she refused to relent, circling, striking, defying the very concept of exhaustion, because to leave now would mean proving the bureaucrats right, it would mean admitting air power was dead, and she had sworn to herself long ago that she would never let that be true as long as she still had the strength to fly. The eastern horizon was beginning to pale with the faintest smear of gray, a cruel reminder that dawn was approaching and with it the risk of being exposed in full light. Yet for Elena in the cockpit of her battered A-10 there was no thought of retreat, only the raw need to hold the line for a few more minutes, then a few more, then another. Each decision made in the space between her dwindling fuel and the desperate cries of the SEALs below who clung to their positions like men already carved into stone, their faces streaked with grime and blood, their weapons nearly dry, yet their spirits kept alive by the sound of her engines tearing across the sky. Every pass she made now was a gamble, her cannon nearly silent from exhaustion, her missiles spent, leaving only the weight of her presence and the threat it carried to the insurgents, who despite their numbers and ferocity could not shake the dread that came with knowing the sky itself had turned against them. They rallied again, pouring fighters from hidden trails, dragging heavy weapons into the open, firing upward with renewed rage, their tracers cutting red scars into the air, and Elena could feel the heat of rounds slamming into her armor, the frame of the A-10 shuddering under impacts that would have torn apart a lesser aircraft. But this beast was built for punishment, and she pressed her stick forward, rolling into a dive that carried her so close she could see the whites of faces staring up. In terror before she unleashed her last bursts of fire, tearing through their charge and scattering them once more into the chaos of dust and fear. On the ground Warren seized the moment, rallying his men to shift positions, to push back into better cover, to patch their wounded with whatever they had left, and for the first time in hours he felt the tide of despair break, not because their situation had grown any less dire but because they had seen the impossible. An angel of war in steel and fire who refused to abandon them even when every gauge and protocol screamed that she should. Elena's mind burned with focus, every muscle taut, every nerve alight with the singular drive to keep going, and in the back of her mind she remembered the endless arguments in sterile conference rooms where men in suits declared the A-10 a relic, where analysts waved charts showing how drones could strike from afar without risking pilots, how jets designed for speed could deliver bombs and be gone before the enemy blinked, and she had sat in silence in those rooms because her words meant nothing to men who had never felt the ground shake under their own boots. But now, here in this valley where every bullet had a name and every scream was carved into stone, she was proving them wrong with every heartbeat, with every defiant pass of her wings, and she swore silently that even if this was her last sortie, even if this jet fell apart around her, she would not let the lie of air power's death stand unchallenged. The insurgents knew dawn would expose everything, and they poured forward in one last gamble, mortars thumping, machine guns rattling, fighters screaming prayers as they charged into the thinning fire of the SEALs, who fought back with knives, pistols, and whatever ammunition they could scrape from the dirt, and it seemed for a terrible moment as though the sheer tide of men would overwhelm them. But then the valley roared again, not from Elena's cannon but from her engines as she dropped low in a pass that scattered the charge by sheer force of presence, the psychological hammer of her defiance breaking their courage more effectively than any weapon left in her arsenal, and Warren knew in his bones that the enemy's will was finally cracking. Reinforcements were on the way, he reminded himself, helicopters and quick reaction forces scrambling even now, their arrival measured in minutes that felt like eternities, and all they had to do was endure until then. Elena's voice cut through the radio, hoarse but steady, telling them to hold, to breathe, to fight just a little longer, and though she could not see their faces, she knew every man below clenched his teeth and forced himself upright at her words, because her belief had become their belief, her strength their strength. Another burst of fire climbed toward her from the ridges, rounds hammering her fuselage, alarms blaring in her cockpit, and still she flew straight into it, daring the mountain to take her, daring the enemy to bring her down, because every second she stayed overhead was another second those men lived. Her fuel gauge hovered on empty, her hydraulics screamed, the A-10 groaned under wounds no machine should endure, and yet she kept her course, eyes locked on the horizon as the first hints of sunlight painted the peaks in blood-red light. On the ground the SEALs roared as if their throats could tear the sky open themselves, charging into the broken remains of the enemy with knives and fists and fire, the sudden surge of momentum catching the insurgents off guard, sending them fleeing into caves and gullies, abandoning their weapons as the realization hit them that this was no longer a battle but a rout. Elena circled once more, her breath ragged, her vision tunneling from exhaustion, but she stayed until the first helicopters crested the ridges, their rotors chopping the air, their guns blazing into what remained of the enemy lines, and only then did she allow herself to breathe, only then did she admit that she had done what no one else believed possible, she had kept them alive. As Warren looked up and saw her battered jet limping across the dawn sky, smoke trailing from its wounds yet wings steady, he whispered into his radio that air power was not dead, that it had saved them when nothing else could, and though Elena could not hear him over the alarms and static, she felt the truth of it in her bones, a truth no briefing room or spreadsheet could ever erase. The sun finally crested the jagged horizon, bleeding gold and crimson across the valley that had been hell only hours before, and as the helicopters swept low, disgorging fresh troops to secure the ground, the SEALs collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to cheer, too battered to even speak, their bodies heavy with the weight of survival, yet their eyes followed the battered silhouette of the A-10 climbing toward the light as though watching a myth carve itself into the sky, and Warren, lying on his back with his chest heaving, knew that what had happened here would never be understood by the men who shuffled papers in offices thousands of miles away, men who would call it an anomaly, a statistical blip, a mission that succeeded by chance rather than by the defiance of one pilot who had refused to bow to obsolescence. Elena could feel the toll in every nerve of her body, her hands trembling on the controls, her helmet slick with sweat, the cockpit reeking of burned circuitry and cordite, warning lights flashing in angry red across her console, yet there was also a calm inside her, a stillness that came only after fighting beyond exhaustion, the kind of stillness her instructors used to call the warrior's clarity, and in that clarity she replayed every moment of the night, every strafing run, every scream. Over the radio, every decision to stay when logic screamed to leave, and she understood that something had shifted within her as much as in those men she had saved. She had defied her orders, broken every protocol drilled into her by command, and yet she knew in her heart that she had done the only thing worth doing, because wars were not fought in spreadsheets, they were fought in valleys like this one, in blood and dust and the bond between warriors who might never even see each other's faces. The helicopters cleared the last resistance, gunfire tapering into silence, and the valley settled into an eerie calm, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of radios now alive with chatter from the reinforcements. But Warren's team could only whisper among themselves about the pilot who had refused to leave, their voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile miracle that had carried them into morning. For Elena, the return flight was a blur of alarms and fatigue, her plane dragging itself through the air on sheer willpower as much as thrust, and when she finally touched down on the makeshift runway at the forward base, sparks showered from the landing gear, tires screaming against metal, but she kept the beast steady until it came to a halt, its fuselage riddled with scars, its paint scorched, its wings trembling but unbroken, a mirror of its pilot. Ground crews swarmed, their eyes wide as they saw the damage, some muttering that it was impossible she had kept the thing airborne, but Elena ignored them as she climbed down, her legs buckling for a moment before she forced herself upright, her visor hiding eyes that burned not from tears but from a fury still alive inside her. The squadron commander stormed across the tarmac, face twisted in rage, already shouting about disobeyed orders, about risking assets, about undermining the chain of command, and Elena stood in silence as his words washed over her like meaningless noise, because she had just come from a place where words did not matter, where only action decided who lived and who died. She thought of Warren and his men even now being lifted out of that valley, bloodied but alive, whispering to each other about the angel of thunder who had carried them, and she decided the commander's anger was nothing compared to their survival. When she finally pulled off her helmet, sweat-streaked hair clinging to her face, she met his glare without flinching, her voice low and steady as she said she would take every reprimand, every punishment, but she would never apologize for saving warriors who had been abandoned by the very people shouting at her now. The commander sputtered, torn between the impossible truth of what she had accomplished and the rigid doctrine that demanded obedience, and in that hesitation Elena saw the entire rot of the system, the way it cared more about control than survival, more about image than reality. Later, alone in the barracks, she sat on the edge of her cot, staring at her hands still trembling from the fight, and she wondered if anyone would ever understand what had really happened, if anyone would ever believe that the A-10 had once again proven itself indispensable, not as a relic but as a savior. Reports would be written, numbers filed, terms like close call and unexpected support, buried in bureaucratic language, but she knew the truth, and so did those SEALs, and that was enough for her. Warren, flown to a medical station with his wounded, kept asking for a radio long enough to send a single message back to base. Tell the pilot she saved them, tell her air power lives, tell her they will never forget. The message reached Elena hours later, delivered by a weary comms officer who seemed unsure why such words mattered. But when she read them, a faint smile broke across her face, the first since she had entered the valley. She leaned back against the cold wall, closing her eyes, hearing again the roar of her engines in the night, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the fight for the soul of air power was not lost, that as long as there were warriors on the ground and pilots willing to risk everything above them, the sky would never truly fall silent. Days later, long after the smoke had cleared from the valley and the SEAL team had been evacuated to safety, the battle still lived inside Elena with a weight she carried through every waking moment and into every restless dream, and though she returned to flying patrols as ordered, the memory of that night clung to her like the scar tissue that coated her A-10, each dent and burn mark on the fuselage a testament to the fury she had endured and refused to surrender to, and while maintenance crews patched and painted, she insisted they leave the scars visible, a reminder not of damage but of defiance, though she knew the higher-ups would never see it that way. Reports filtered through the chain of command like whispers passed in the dark, some sanitized to hide the truth, others exaggerated to make it sound like luck rather than skill, and she heard the debates beginning again in conference rooms where analysts tried to turn her actions into data points, stripping away the sweat, the screams, the blood, the sheer will of survival, and she felt the old anger rising in her chest, the same anger she had carried when commanders dismissed her plane as obsolete, because she knew what those men in the valley had known, that nothing about that night had been obsolete, that the only thing outdated was the belief that wars could be fought without humanity, without risk, without the bond between the ground and the sky. Meanwhile, Warren lay in a hospital bed, stitches pulling at his skin, his body a map of bruises and burns, but his mind was sharper than ever, and he spoke to anyone who would listen about the pilot who had saved them, about the storm of thunder that had descended when hope had died, and his words spread through the ranks of operators who had long felt abandoned by promises of technology that never seemed to answer in their darkest hours. Within days, the legend of the woman in the A-10 began to take shape, whispered in chow halls, repeated on dusty airstrips, passed from soldier to soldier until it became more than just a story. It became proof that the sky still had teeth, that somewhere above them a warrior still fought for them. Elena, though, was less interested in legend than in truth, and the truth weighed heavily on her because she knew she had not saved them alone. She had nearly died with them, and every time she closed her eyes she could still hear the mortars landing, still see the tracers clawing upward, still feel the jet shudder under impacts that should have torn her apart, and she wondered if the next sortie would be her last, if the next valley would claim her before she could claw another team back from the edge. Yet there was also pride, quiet and unspoken, pride that she had chosen to stay, that she had proved something even if only to herself, and it kept her walking forward despite the reprimands that came down from her commanders, long pages of official censure that spoke of insubordination, recklessness, and disobedience, as though survival itself had been a crime. She signed the papers without flinching, her pen carving her name into the record, and when her commander told her she had disgraced the squadron, she met his eyes with a calm that unsettled him, replying only that she would fly again tomorrow if the ground called for her. The commander had no answer for that, because even he knew that the truth of war did not live in his office, it lived in valleys like the one Elena had turned into thunder. Warren recovered slowly, his team scattered by injuries and rotations, but the bond forged in fire was not easily broken, and he wrote letters. Letters to families, letters to commanders, and one letter to Elena herself, thanking her not with flowery words but with the raw honesty of a man who had seen death and chosen to live because she had given him that chance, and though she never wrote back, she kept the letter folded in her flight suit pocket, a talisman she carried every time she climbed into the cockpit. Rumors reached her of debates in Washington reigniting, of politicians demanding to know why the A-10 was still in service, of generals defending budgets and programs that had never saved a single life in a firefight, and she laughed bitterly, because she knew none of them had ever looked down the barrel of annihilation and seen salvation arrive in the shape of a steel beast flying so low it tore the mountains open. She realized then that she did not fly for them, had never flown for them. She flew for the men and women on the ground, for the warriors who prayed to the sky not for drones or satellites but for the roar of engines and the certainty of human eyes and hands guiding salvation into the fight. Each night when she sat alone in the barracks, listening to the silence settle over the base, she could still hear that valley calling to her, reminding her that wars were not won by numbers or doctrines but by choices made in the crucible of fear, and she promised herself that if ever another call came she would answer it, no matter what orders said. For Warren and his men, the memory of that night became a touchstone, a story they would tell over beers in hushed tones in barracks, to new recruits who had never yet felt the despair of abandonment, and each telling carried the same truth, that air power was not dead, because they had lived to prove it. Weeks turned into months, and though time dulled the bruises and healed the wounds, the memory of that valley remained carved into the souls of everyone who had been there, and for Elena it became a shadow she carried into every mission, a reminder that every sortie might become another night of fire and desperation, another test of whether she was willing to stay when everything screamed to leave, and as she flew her patrols across barren mountains and endless deserts she often wondered if somewhere below another team was waiting, radios crackling with unanswered calls, hearts sinking under the weight of silence, hoping against hope that the sky would remember them, and she promised herself silently that if she was the one in the air, she would never let them be forgotten. The A-10 she flew had been patched together more times than she could count, its fuselage scarred and its paint peeling, but she loved it all the more for those imperfections, because each mark told a story, each dent was proof of survival, each scorch mark a reminder that the beast could take punishment no other aircraft could endure and still bring her home, and when she ran her hands across its armor before takeoff, it felt less like preparing a machine than like saluting an old comrade. Meanwhile, Warren returned to duty as soon as his body allowed, scars tight across his skin, muscles still aching from wounds, but his resolve sharper than ever, and though his team had been scattered, he carried their bond with him into every operation, a bond fueled not only by shared blood but by the memory of thunder rolling in the night, and he spoke often of Elena though most of his peers had never met her, his words carrying a conviction that made even the most skeptical operators believe that somewhere above air power still lived. The legend of the A-10 pilot who had refused to leave spread quietly, not in official reports or commendations but in stories passed between soldiers, stories that grew with each telling until she became almost mythical, a guardian who descended when hope was gone, and though Elena herself dismissed such talk as exaggeration, deep inside she knew that myths often carried truths facts could not capture, and she accepted that if her defiance could give warriors on the ground even a sliver of faith then she would bear the weight of their myth. Yet command did not see it that way. Meetings were held, reprimands renewed, threats of grounding whispered in her ear, but each time they stopped short of actually pulling her from the sky, because even the most rigid officers could not ignore the reality that she had saved lives when no one else could, and though they called it insubordination, they knew deep down it had been necessity. Elena herself wrestled with that duality, torn between her duty to obey and her duty to protect, and she wondered often whether the next choice she made would cost her career, her freedom, or her life, yet she always returned to the cockpit because flying was not her job, it was her oath. One night, during another deployment, the call came again, different valley, different terrain, but the same desperate voices crackling through static, a team ambushed, outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and without hesitation she banked her jet toward the coordinates, her heart steady, her body moving on instinct, and though she knew this could be the moment her luck ran out, she welcomed it with the calm of a warrior who had already made peace with sacrifice, because she had chosen long ago to measure her life not by safety but by the lives she could save. As she roared into the valley, the insurgents below scattered in terror at the sight of her silhouette, their fire faltering as memories of legends whispered through their ranks, and she realized then that she had become more than just a pilot. She had become a weapon of fear, not just for her firepower but for the defiance she embodied, and fear was sometimes the sharpest blade a warrior could wield. On the ground, the trapped soldiers lifted their heads at the sound of her engines, disbelief melting into hope, and once again the bond between sky and earth was reforged in fire. Warren, hearing the news from afar, clenched his fists with pride, knowing she was still out there, still flying, still proving wrong every voice that had ever tried to declare her obsolete, and he vowed silently that one day he would stand before her and tell her face to face what her thunder had meant to him and his men. Elena did not think of legends or promises as she dove into her runs. Her focus absolute, her will unyielding, her eyes locked on targets that would never again overwhelm the soldiers she guarded, and as the valley echoed with her fury, she whispered into her mask the same vow she had made before, that she would not leave until every man below was safe or until she had nothing left to give. The war ground on, as wars always do, an endless churn of missions and ambushes and briefings, but for Elena and the soldiers who had once felt her thunder, something had changed forever, and though official reports never told the truth, the legend lived in the quiet places where warriors gather, in whispered stories told over flickering campfires, in bars on bases where scars were compared and grief poured into glasses, in the letters home where soldiers left out the worst parts but always included the one bright fact, that when they thought they had been abandoned, the sky had not forgotten them, because she had come. For Elena the legend felt heavy, like a cloak she had not asked to wear, but she carried it with the same stubborn strength she carried everything, because she knew it was not really about her but about the bond between the ground and the air, the faith that one would never leave the other behind, and if she became the symbol of that faith, then she would bear it as long as her wings held. Her commanders continued to fight her, grounding her for weeks, lecturing her about protocol, dragging her into hearings where words like insubordination and liability were hurled at her, but each time the ground called again, each time a team was pinned down in a valley with nowhere else to turn, someone always released her back into the sky, because even bureaucracy could not deny the simple truth that when survival was at stake, doctrine meant nothing without thunder overhead. Warren eventually returned to full strength, scars lining his body but fire in his eyes, and when he took command of a new team he carried with him a lesson he drilled into every operator under his charge. Never believe the sky is silent, never give up before you hear the engines because somewhere above, a warrior might be fighting her own battle to reach you, and you owe her your faith as much as your own courage. His men did not know her face, but they carried her myth into every firefight, whispering her name when radios failed, believing that if they called hard enough she would come, and that belief often gave them the strength to endure until reinforcements arrived. Elena herself heard these whispers secondhand, sometimes from mechanics, sometimes from medics, sometimes from soldiers she had never met who stopped her on dusty runways to shake her hand with a reverence that embarrassed her, because she did not see herself as a savior, only as a soldier who had refused to leave, but she accepted their gratitude with quiet nods, never denying them the comfort of their faith. Years passed, and still the debate raged in Washington, men in suits trying to kill the A-10 program again and again, citing cost and strategy and modernity, but each time someone stood up in defense, a general or a senator or a soldier who had been in a valley like Warren's, and each time Elena's name was whispered in those halls though never written into the records, a ghost the bureaucracy could not erase. The scars on her jet grew with every deployment, a patchwork of steel and stubbornness, until it became a symbol itself, a flying relic of every argument she had ever fought with her life, and younger pilots looked at her with awe, some calling her reckless, others calling her brave, all knowing she had walked a line none of them had ever dared. One night, after a particularly brutal mission where she once again returned with her jet bleeding smoke but her soldiers alive, she stood alone on the tarmac and looked up at the stars, wondering how much longer she could keep doing this, how many more valleys she could fly into before her luck or her machine finally failed, and she whispered into the silence that if that day came, she hoped the soldiers below would at least know she had not left them willingly, that she had fought until her last breath. Warren eventually found her again years after that first night, when fate placed them at the same forward base for a brief overlap, and when he walked across the dusty tarmac to meet her, neither spoke at first, both simply standing in the presence of the bond forged in fire, and when he finally extended his hand, his voice steady, he told her the words he had carried since that valley, that she had given them back their lives when no one else would, that she had proven air power was not dead, but alive in every beat of her engines, and that they would carry her thunder with them forever. Elena took his hand, her eyes unflinching, and replied simply that she had only done what needed to be done, but in her chest she felt a warmth she rarely allowed herself, the quiet knowledge that her choice had mattered, that it had changed not only his life but the faith of every soldier who had heard the story since. When he left, she returned to her jet, running her hands across its scarred skin as she always did, and she realized then that this was her legacy. Not medals or commendations, not the approval of commanders or politicians, but the simple unbreakable truth that when warriors on the ground cried out, she had answered, and in answering she had reminded them that the sky was never empty, that somewhere above a stubborn pilot still believed in them. The war would end someday as all wars do, but the story would not, because legends outlive battles, and long after Elena hung up her wings, long after the A-10s were retired and parked in museums, soldiers would still whisper of the night when the SEALs declared air power dead and a single woman in a steel beast refused to let it die, her engines thundering back into the fight, her roar echoing through mountains and into memory, proof that as long as courage exists, the sky will never fall. Silent. The end.